The Copper Kettle Diner in Ledgewood, Pennsylvania was packed that Thursday morning when Sheriff Hollis Brackett shoved his chair back from booth 7 and accused the waitress of stealing his wallet. Josie Calloway was 27, a widow, a mother, and she'd been on her feet since before sunrise. She didn't argue. She set the coffee pot down, held both hands out where every person in that room could see them, and asked him to check her apron pocket right then and there in front of everybody. He never looked. He crossed the floor in 3 steps, pinned her arm down across the table, and sent a coffee cup rolling into the half-eaten plate of eggs belonging to the man in the corner booth. "Consider this my final warning," he said, close enough that she felt it. Then he put her in handcuffs in the middle of the diner, and the deputy pulled them tighter than he had to. Behind the counter, the owner brought both hands up to her mouth. A phone came up somewhere near the window and went right back down when the deputy turned his head. 40 people watched, and not one of them spoke a second time, because in a town Hollis Brackett had run for 21 years, folks had learned exactly what speaking up cost you. At 8 o'clock, her phone started ringing in her apron pocket. She begged him to let her answer it. She told him it was a hospital calling about her little girl. The deputy pulled it out, put it to his ear, and hung it up. And in the corner booth, a man in a worn canvas jacket that nobody in Ledgewood had ever laid eyes on before set his cup down, watched every second of it, and quietly reached for his own phone. Hollis Brackett had no idea who he'd just done that in front of. He didn't know that the quiet man in the corner could have ended his career before the eggs went cold, and he couldn't have guessed why that man chose to sit there and say nothing at all for the rest of that morning instead. If stories about ordinary people finding their courage mean something to you, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs it today. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that Thursday morning in Ledgewood, and to the woman who was still pouring coffee when it all began. Just a short distance from the diner, across the main road, the lights inside the Ledgewood Police Department had been burning long before dawn, because Hollis Brackett made a habit of arriving before every one of his subordinates, not because he was hard-working, but because he liked being the first person to open the mail. That morning, among the stack of papers, there was an envelope bearing the seal of the state auditor's office, and he read it twice, slowly, without overlooking a single line. It was a notice of the routine inventory of the evidence storage room, the kind that arrived every few years and had always passed through this department as quietly as water flowing over stone, except that this time it named a specific date, and that date was the following Monday. Brackett folded the letter along its original creases, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, placed it beneath another stack of files, then closed the drawer with a very gentle motion. He sat still for a while, both hands resting on the desktop, staring through the window at the glowing panes of the Copper Kettle across the road. When Curtis Dunlap came in carrying 2 cups of coffee, Brackett didn't ask about the night shift, and he didn't ask about the petty incidents from the weekend. He asked only one question, and he asked it in the calm voice of a man considering whether to buy a new tire. He asked who at the diner across the road was least likely to have anyone stand up for them. Dunlap set the coffee down, thought for a moment, then answered. He didn't ask why. In all the years Curtis Dunlap had worked under Hollis Brackett, he had never once asked why, and that was precisely why he was still sitting in that chair, while so many others had either left or been pushed out. Across the road, in the kitchen still dim with steam, Bernice Alderman was turning the first batch of bacon when she looked up at Josie, who was retightening the strings of her apron, and said something that had nothing to do with the morning. She asked whether Josie remembered the day she had signed Mr. Kessler's paper. Josie said of course she remembered. It had happened 6 weeks earlier, right outside the diner, when the old mechanic had been stopped and his battered truck searched in broad daylight, and all the cash he was carrying to buy equipment had been taken without anyone giving him a proper receipt. 7 or 8 people had stood there watching that day. When Mr. Kessler's lawyer went looking for someone willing to confirm that he hadn't resisted, hadn't raised his voice, and hadn't done anything except ask why, every person who had witnessed it suddenly remembered that they had been busy, or too far away to hear clearly, or merely passing by. Josie was the only one who put her name on the paper. Bernice had warned her not to sign. She had stood in this very spot, still holding the spatula in one hand, and told Josie that this was a very small town, that people didn't forget, and that she had a child to support. Josie listened to every word, nodded, thanked her, and signed anyway. Beginning the following week, Hollis Brackett started eating breakfast at the Copper Kettle 3 times a week, though before that he had stopped in only a couple of times during the entire year. Every time, he sat at table 7, the table tucked neatly inside Josie's section. Ordered black coffee without sugar, finished 1 cup, then remained there for another half-hour without doing anything at all. That morning, Bernice watched Josie carry her tray toward the row of tables beside the windows, and she said softly, almost as though speaking only to herself, that the girl wasn't the first person to stand in that exact place and put a name on a piece of paper. No one in the kitchen understood what she meant, and no one asked. At 6 o'clock in the morning, while Josie was wiping down the row of tables beside the windows and Curtis Dunlap was finishing his coffee across the road, an old pickup truck turned onto the dirt lane leading to the cemetery at the edge of town and shut off its engine. The man who stepped out looked to be in his late 30s. He wore a faded canvas jacket and carried a small bouquet without any wrapping paper. He didn't ask anyone for directions, and he didn't look around for a row or plot number. He walked straight ahead, turned left at the second path, and stopped before a low headstone tucked farther inside, the kind of inexpensive marker people chose when they had very little left. It bore only a name and 2 lines of dates. No title, no inscription, not a single word saying whose mother she had been, whose wife she had been, or what she had done with her life. Emilio Castellano set the flowers down, brushed a few dry leaves away from the base of the stone with the back of his hand, then crouched until he was level with the carved letters. He stayed that way for a while without speaking. Then, in a very quiet voice, he said he had come later than usual this year, and he was sorry for that. He said he had thought about sending someone else in his place, as he had 2 years earlier, but he hadn't done it. He said there were things he still hadn't been able to put right, that he knew she wouldn't be pleased if she knew what he had to do to fix them, but he was going to do it anyway, because if he didn't, there was no one else left who would. He fell silent again for a while, then said one final thing. He told her he had made her a promise and still hadn't kept it, and that this morning he was going to do something he should have done a very long time ago. He stood, wiped his hands against his pant legs, and didn't look at the headstone again. On his way out, he stopped at the entrance to the path and looked toward the far end of the main road, where the lights had just come on inside the windows of a small diner, spilling a long ribbon of yellow across the still wet pavement. He stood there for a very long time, much longer than he had stood before the grave, both hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes fixed on that glowing window. For a moment, he lifted one hand and touched the breast pocket of his jacket, where something flat and hard rested, then lowered it again. After that, he climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove slowly toward the center of town, so slowly that a person on foot could have kept pace beside him. The pickup truck didn't carry plates from this county, and in all those years, no one in Ledgewood had ever seen it before. The bell above the door of the copper kettle gave a light jingle at nearly 7 o'clock, and Josie looked up to see a stranger step inside, pausing for a moment on the threshold as though measuring the room with his eyes before setting foot in it. He wore a faded canvas jacket and old shoes, and there was nothing about him that made anyone look twice. He didn't choose the counter like the laborers who came in early, and he didn't choose the row of tables by the windows. He walked straight toward the small table in the farthest corner, the most secluded table in the diner, where he could see the entire room, both the front door and the kitchen entrance, and he sat with his back against the wall. Josie brought him a menu, set it down in front of him, filled his water glass, and asked what he would like. He didn't open the menu. He gently pushed it aside and placed his order in the calm voice of a man who had memorized the words a very long time ago. He wanted 2 eggs fried over hard, with no runny yolk left inside, toast scorched along the edges but not burned in the middle, and coffee diluted by half with hot water, not milk. Josie wrote down the first 2 words, then her pen stopped. She looked up at him. In all the years she had worked in that diner, every kind of person had sat at those tables and ordered every kind of peculiar thing. Some wanted every trace of salt left out, while others asked for 3 extra pickle slices beside their eggs. But no one, not once, had ever ordered breakfast that way. She told him exactly that. She said she had worked there a long time and had never heard anyone order a meal like that before. The man looked at her for a moment, and something very faint passed across his face and vanished at once, so quickly that Josie would have missed it if she had blinked. He only said it was how someone he once knew used to eat breakfast. Josie nodded, finished writing the order, and turned away. Behind the counter, Bernice Alderman was drying several spoons that had just been rinsed in hot water. She had heard every word. The spoon slipped from her hand, struck the tile floor, and bounced with a sharp, dry sound. loud enough to make 2 or 3 nearby customers turn their heads. Bernice didn't bend down to pick it up. She remained where she was, her hand still held in the shape of gripping a spoon that was no longer there, and she stared at the man seated at the corner table. She stared for so long that Josie had to call her name twice before she startled and turned around. Bernice said nothing. She picked up the spoon, dropped it into the basin to be rinsed again, then went into the kitchen and stayed there for nearly half an hour. At the corner table, the man ate very slowly. He cut the eggs into small pieces, chewed each bite carefully, and now and then paused to take a sip of the weak coffee, while his eyes never left the room. He watched the way Josie moved among the tables. At the second table from the windows sat 2 men in white shirts and wristwatches, who had arrived in the nearly new car parked outside. At the counter sat an old man with worn elbows on his coat, who ordered only a cup of coffee and nursed it for an hour. Josie refilled the cups on both sides in exactly the same way. She didn't bend lower, smile more brightly, or speak more warmly to the 2 men in white shirts. She didn't move faster or answer more curtly when she served the old man at the counter. When he asked whether there was apple pie that day, she stopped completely, placed both hands on the edge of the counter, and gave him a full answer as though he had just ordered a grand meal. The man at the corner table set down his coffee cup. He watched that moment longer than he had watched anything else since entering the diner. Then he picked up his fork, cut another piece of egg, and said nothing. At 7:35, the bell above the door rang again, and this time everyone in the diner knew who had walked in without needing to look up. The conversations at the tables didn't stop altogether, but they dropped by a degree, as though someone had quietly turned down a radio without realizing they were doing it. Hollis Brackett entered first, Curtis Dunlap followed behind him, and Micah Rowan came last, the young deputy who had been on the job for 2 years and still had the habit of nodding a greeting to every person he passed. Brackett greeted no one. He walked straight to table 7, removed his hat and placed it on the back of the chair, sat down, and as he pulled the chair in, he took a leather wallet from his back pocket and set it on the table, directly in the center, in the most visible place. He didn't put it down carelessly. He placed it there, then turned it slightly until it lay perfectly straight and parallel to the edge of the table. Dunlap sat across from him. Micah took the chair at the end, and his eyes rested on the wallet longer than he intended. Josie brought over the coffee pot and filled all 3 cups, and Brackett didn't thank her or say anything beyond a low yes when she asked whether he wanted anything else. She turned away. The wallet remained exactly where it was. For nearly half an hour, Brackett finished his first cup of coffee, ordered a second, and talked with Dunlap about things that had nothing to do with police work, about the price of firewood that season, about the bridge out on Route 4 that would soon need repairs, about the son of an acquaintance who had moved to another state for work. He never opened the wallet. He never touched it. It simply lay there on the table between the sugar dish and the pepper shaker, in plain view of anyone who passed through that section. Josie walked by twice to refill his cup, and both times she poured from the opposite side, never letting her hand pass over the wallet. Micah watched her, then looked at the wallet, then at his chief. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down, then picked it up again. For a moment, he leaned slightly forward, his lips parting as though he were about to say something very simple. Perhaps that the chief should put his wallet away before it fell, or that he would hand him the saucer. Dunlap glanced at him once. Just one look, brief and without anything threatening in it. Micah closed his mouth and lowered his eyes to his coffee. He said nothing. At the corner table in the back of the room, the man in the canvas jacket had nearly finished his eggs. He didn't openly stare toward table 7. But when Brackett set down the wallet and turned it until it was straight, the man had stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth, holding it there for exactly 1 beat before continuing to eat. After that, he didn't look in that direction again. He simply sat there, finished the last of his toast, occasionally took a sip of the weak coffee that had gone cold, and let the morning move around him. Outside the windows, daylight had fully arrived. In the kitchen, Bernice turned the final batch of pancakes, and didn't come out to the dining room even once. At 8 o'clock, Hollis Brackett shoved his chair back from table 7 and accused Josie of stealing his wallet. Josie set the coffee pot down, held both hands out where every person in that room could see them, and asked him to check her apron pocket right then and there. He never looked. He crossed the floor, pinned her arm down across the table, and sent a coffee cup rolling straight into the half-eaten plate of eggs belonging to the man in the corner booth. "Consider this my final warning," he said, close enough that she felt it. Then he put her in handcuffs in the middle of the diner, and Dunlap pulled them tighter than he had to. When her phone started ringing in her apron pocket, Josie begged him to let her answer the hospital calling about her little girl. Dunlap pulled it out, put it to his ear, and hung it up without a word. After that, Curtis Dunlap led Josie outside through the front door, one hand holding her by the elbow, and the entire diner watched until the door closed behind them. He opened the back door of the patrol car parked against the curb, let her sit inside, then shut it, and leaned against the door, lighting a cigarette and looking up the road as though what had just happened inside had nothing to do with him. Hollis Brackett didn't follow them. He stayed behind. He turned toward the center of the room, straightened the front of his coat, and began speaking to the people who were still seated there, using the gentle voice of a man offering an explanation rather than a defense. He said he was very sorry that everyone had been forced to witness something like this on such a beautiful morning. He said he didn't like doing things of that nature, but there were times when a person wasn't permitted to close his eyes and let matters pass. Then he began to talk about her. He said everyone in town knew how difficult that young woman's circumstances had been, that he had heard about the hospital bills, the rent, and the pressure of a woman raising a child alone. He said it with compassion, and it was that compassion that made the words most poisonous, because he wasn't accusing her of anything. He was simply placing a mold inside the listeners' minds and allowing them to fit her into it themselves. He said that when people were driven to the end of the road, they could do things they would never ordinarily consider, and he hoped the court would take that into account. A few people nodded, not because they believed him, but because nodding was the easiest thing they could do at that moment. Brackett turned toward the door and called outside, telling Dunlap to make sure the report stated that the subject had become agitated and uncooperative during the encounter. Dunlap nodded through the glass, took the notebook from his breast pocket, and wrote down several words without asking a single question. It was then that an old man seated at the counter, the one who had spent the morning nursing a single cup of coffee, set his cup down and spoke. His voice was small and trembling, but in the silence of the diner, every word carried clearly. He said he had been sitting right there since early morning, and he had seen the police chief pay his bill and put the wallet into his back pocket. He said he had seen it plainly, because he was sitting directly in line with him. Hollis Brackett didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, step forward, or say a single word. He merely turned his head and looked at the old man. He stared straight at him without blinking, long enough for everyone in the diner to understand that the memory of that look would remain in this town long after the morning was over. The old man sat back down. His hand found the coffee cup again, but he didn't lift it. He didn't speak a second time. Micah Rowan stood a few steps away, and he lowered his eyes toward the small camera fastened to his chest. The indicator light was still glowing. He looked at it longer than necessary, then raised his eyes to the old man at the counter, then toward the door through which Josie had just been taken. He didn't lift a hand to touch the camera. He didn't say anything either. Throughout those 40 minutes, the man seated at the corner table in the back of the room didn't stand up once. He remained exactly where he was, his back against the wall, with the half-eaten plate of eggs now cold before him and stained with coffee along one side. He had heard every word Brackett said. He had seen the old man sit back down. He could have ended the entire thing with a single sentence. All he had to do was stand and speak his name in the middle of the room, and everything would have stopped at once. He knew that more clearly than anyone else in the diner. Still, he remained silent. He folded his napkin in half, then opened it again, and he watched Hollis Brackett with the eyes of a man committing something to memory, not the eyes of a man consumed by anger. Hollis Brackett picked up his hat, put it on, and walked toward the door with the stride of a man who had finished his work and was satisfied with what he had done. At that exact moment, at the corner table in the back of the room, the man in the canvas jacket picked up the final piece of toast and ate it. He ate no faster and no slower than before. Then he took the napkin, folded it in half, folded it once more, and placed it neatly beside his plate. He pushed his chair back and stood. The entire diner fell silent, not because he spoke loudly, because he hadn't spoken at all. It was because, in a room where everyone had been holding their breath for 40 minutes, that deliberate slowness sounded louder than any shout. Brackett stopped at the threshold and turned his head. The man walked toward him, stopped about 2 steps away, no closer, and asked his first question. He asked whether Brackett had turned out the pockets of her apron. Brackett looked him up and down, then replied that it hadn't been necessary. The man nodded as though he had received a perfectly reasonable answer. He let a moment pass, then asked his second question. He asked whether Brackett had reviewed the footage from the camera mounted above the counter. Brackett answered that the camera couldn't prove anyone's intentions, and that he had been doing this work for a long time and didn't need a machine to tell him what he was looking at. The man nodded again. He didn't argue a single word. Then he asked his third question, and he asked it in exactly the same voice he had used for the first two, without emphasis, without pausing to draw breath, as though it were the most ordinary question of the three. He asked how much money had been in Brackett's wallet. Brackett answered $3,000. He answered immediately, almost before the man had finished asking, in the irritated voice of someone who wanted the conversation over, then added that it was none of his business and that he should leave. The man didn't leave. He said thank you. He said the police chief had just given complete answers to 3 questions he should have remained silent about, and that it had been an interesting morning. He said all of it without sarcasm and without raising his voice, like a customer complimenting the eggs. Then he wished Brackett a good day. Brackett stood there staring at him, and for one brief second, something passed across his face that even he hadn't yet found a name for, the dim sensation of a man who had missed a step in the darkness and still didn't know whether he had fallen. The man returned to the corner table, put on his jacket, straightened the collar, and took a bill from an inside pocket. He placed it beneath the edge of the plate, as neatly as he had folded the napkin. It was a bill worth many times the price of his breakfast, large enough that the waitress on the next shift would have to pick it up and look at it twice while clearing the table. He didn't call anyone over to settle the check. He didn't wait for change. He walked straight toward the door, past Hollis Brackett without looking at him, and pushed the door open. The bell jingled behind him. Brackett spun around and shouted after him, and this time there was nothing gentle left in his voice. It broke into something sharp and furious. He shouted that in this town, people knew exactly who earned an honest living, and who was nothing but an unemployed drifter wandering from one place to another, and that he had better remember the face of this diner so he would never come back. Several people inside turned to look. The old man at the counter raised his head. Micah Rowan stood frozen in the middle of the room. Beyond the glass door, the man in the faded canvas jacket walked down the steps, crossed the sidewalk, and didn't look back once. He didn't quicken his pace. His shoulders didn't tense. He passed the parked patrol car, cast one quick glance through the rear window, then continued toward the parking lot at the end of the row of buildings, where his old pickup truck was waiting. The pickup truck was parked in a hidden corner at the far end of the lot, facing toward the road, and Emilio Castellano climbed behind the wheel, but didn't put the key into the ignition. He pulled the door shut, rested both hands on the steering wheel for a moment, then took out his phone. The first call connected after half a ring. He didn't greet anyone or give his name. He said he needed the complete civil asset forfeiture records for the Ledgewood Town Police Department in Pennsylvania for the past 7 years. Every traffic stop, every amount of cash, and every piece of property seized, along with the number of those cases that had actually led to prosecution. The person on the other end asked him to repeat one detail. He gave the name of the town again, spelling it one letter at a time. Then he said he wanted it before 6 o'clock that evening, and ended the call. The entire conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. He placed the second call immediately afterward, without pausing. He said a waitress had been arrested that morning at a diner called the Copper Kettle on the town's main road, and he needed to know at once if anyone tried to pressure her into signing anything before a lawyer was seated beside her. He said he didn't need to know whether she was right or wrong. He only needed to make certain that didn't happen. The person on the other end asked how he wanted the matter handled. Emilio said to leave that part to him. Their job was to make sure she wasn't forced to sign anything alone. Then he hung up. He sat motionless for several seconds, looking through the windshield at the low building across the road, the old structure with stone steps, and the tarnished brass plaque belonging to the Ledgewood Town government, where the police department and the mayor's office shared the same entrance. He studied it for a while, then placed the third call. He asked who held the mortgage on that building. He specified the Central Town Administration building, not the storage structure behind it. He told them to find out and call him back, then ended the call before the other person could ask another question. He did it the way he had done everything for all those years, without hesitation and without weighing the matter, like a man accustomed to opening doors with his own key who never thought to knock. He set the phone on the passenger seat and leaned back against the seat, his spine straight. The parking lot was empty. From where he sat, he could see one corner of the diner's front, the window glowing with yellow light, and the stretch of sidewalk where the patrol car had just pulled away. He He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out a small photograph, worn soft at all four corners, the kind taken with an old film camera, its colors faded into yellow and brown. He turned it over and looked at it. In the picture, a young woman stood behind a counter, with an apron tied around her waist and a coffee pot in one hand, smiling at the person behind the camera with the kind of smile people gave when someone had just told them to hold still for a picture. Behind her was a row of counter stools and a section of wood-paneled wall. Emilio stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he said, so quietly that he could barely hear himself, that he was doing this again. Mama. He slipped the photograph back into his pocket, patted it once to make sure it was where it belonged, and inserted the key into the ignition. But he didn't start the engine. He remained there a little longer, watching that glowing window until the phone on the seat beside him vibrated with the first incoming message. The holding cell at the Ledgewood Police Department had nothing in it but a concrete bench built into the wall and a small window set too high to reach. And when the iron door closed behind her, the first thing Josie did was ask to make a phone call. She asked in a calm voice. She explained clearly that she didn't need to call a lawyer. She only needed to call the hospital, just once, and the call wouldn't take more than a minute. The officer on duty told her that her phone had already been sealed as evidence and that he had no authority to open the evidence bag. She said she didn't need to hold the phone. She only needed him to read a number from her contacts. He said he couldn't do that. She said she would recite it from memory if she could remember it, then sat down on the concrete bench, closed her eyes, and tried to pull the number out of her mind. She had dialed it more times than she could count over the past several months, but she had always done it by touching the saved name on the screen. And now, when she had to remember each digit one by one, she could recall only the first three before her mind went blank. She sat with her back straight on the concrete bench, both hands resting on her lap, and began to count. 2 blocks away, in the apartment at the end of the hallway, Mrs. Marlene had pulled a wooden chair beside the kitchen table, and Nell was standing on it, both hands gripping the rim of the bowl as she tried to reach the dough in the center. Mrs. Marlene told the girl that she had to stir in only one direction, because if she stirred every which way, the cookies would turn tough. Nell asked why cookies turned tough, and Mrs. Marlene said it was because dough could get dizzy just like people did. The child burst out laughing so hard that her hands nearly slipped from the edge of the bowl, and Mrs. Marlene had to steady her by the back. A long streak of white flour ran across Nell's face from her cheek to her chin. One side of her pigtails had come loose, and she didn't care in the least. She picked up a lump of dough, shaped it into something round and crooked, and held it up proudly, announcing that it was a turtle. Mrs. Marlene told her it was a beautiful turtle and said she would place it in the center of the tray where everyone could see it clearly. In the holding cell, Josie counted to 90, then stopped counting. She looked up at the high window and saw that the light outside had taken on the golden color of midday. She knew the hospital office stayed open until 5 o'clock. She knew they had called at 8 o'clock, and she hadn't been able to answer. She knew that when someone called and no one picked up, they would try once more, perhaps twice, and then move on to the next name on the list, because that was how every list in the world worked, and no one would have done anything wrong. She sat motionless, and she understood with terrible clarity, so deeply that the knowledge seemed to ache inside her bones, that what was passing beyond that window wasn't her time. It was her daughter's. Mrs. Marlene opened the oven and slid the tray inside, and Nell sat down on the floor in front of the glass door, her chin propped in both hands, declaring that she would keep watch until the cookies were done. After a while, she looked up and asked what time her mother would be home. Mrs. Marlene said her mother was working a late shift that day, because the diner was very busy. Nell nodded at once and didn't ask another question, because her mother worked late shifts all the time, and to a child of 4, a late shift was simply a phrase that meant Mama would come home after dinner. Then she turned back toward the oven and said she would save the turtle for her mother. Night fell, and the hallway lights came on, then switched off again according to the timer. Nell slept on the spare bed in Mrs. Marlene's room, with a little flour still caught beneath her fingernails, and beside her pillow sat a small plate covered with a cloth, holding a crooked turtle-shaped cookie that no one was allowed to touch. In the holding cell, Josie didn't lie down. She remained seated all night, her back against the cold wall, her eyes open, listening through the iron door as the clock in the hallway struck each passing hour. And in the second-floor apartment across town, less than a mile away, the kitchen stood completely dark and empty. while the scrap of paper she had torn from her order pad at 4:40 that morning still lay untouched on the table, her rounded handwriting bearing 2 words, "Home early," underlined with a single straight line. The initial appearance was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning at the county courthouse, a red brick building about half an hour's drive from Ledgewood, and Hollis Brackett arrived before the appointed time because he wanted a chance to speak with a few people he knew before everything began. He was standing on the courthouse steps with a cup of coffee in his hand when 3 black cars turned in and stopped directly in front of the entrance, parking one behind another along the curb, and none of them shut off their engines right away. The first person to step out was a man with salt and pepper hair carrying a leather briefcase. He climbed the steps, introduced himself as Gideon Marsh, counsel for the defense, and asked who was in charge of the matter that morning. 2 more men followed him, each carrying a box of documents. They identified themselves as independent auditors and asked where the town police department kept its records archive. A woman with closely cropped hair stepped out of the second car, and when she showed her identification, Brackett had to look at it twice before he managed to read the whole thing. She said her name was Naomi Whitlock, and she said she was there as an observer, not yet in any other capacity. The coffee in Brackett's hand was still hot. He hadn't taken a single sip. The last person to emerge from the final car was a man wearing a faded canvas jacket, the same jacket he had worn the previous morning, the same old shoes, and he walked up the steps no faster and no slower than he had walked out of the copper kettle. Gideon Marsh stepped back half a pace to let him pass. And it was that half step, more than anything else, that made Hollis Brackett understand before he even heard the name. Marsh told the court clerk that his client was Mr. Emilio Castellano. The clerk entered the name into the computer. Someone behind Brackett repeated the surname aloud, and then the entire hallway fell silent for a beat. In the particular way a room only falls silent when someone inside it has recognized something the others haven't yet understood. Curtis Dunlap stood a few steps away, and the hand he had been raising to straighten his collar stopped halfway there. Emilio came to a halt in front of Brackett, no closer than 2 steps, exactly as he had the day before. He said that yesterday the police chief had called him an unemployed drifter in the middle of the diner, in front of everyone seated there. He said he had let the words stand for the rest of the morning, that he hadn't corrected a single one of them, and he asked whether Brackett knew why. Brackett didn't answer. Emilio said he had wanted to see what Brackett would do to someone he believed had no one standing behind him. He spoke in a calm voice, never raising it, and perhaps that was why even the people at the far end of the hallway could hear every word. Then he added that Brackett now had his own answer. The rest unfolded quickly, and without ceremony. Gideon Marsh told the judge that there was no physical evidence, no search report, no recorded footage entered into the case file, and that the arresting officer's statement contradicted the accounts of the witnesses who were present in the courthouse. He produced a list of names. The judge read the file, looked up at Brackett only once, then vacated the detention order and authorized the defendant's immediate release. A side door opened, and Josie stepped into the hallway, still wearing her diner uniform, her apron removed, folded, and draped over one arm. She stood there looking at all the strangers filling the hallway. The black cars parked outside, the boxes of documents, the identification cards. She didn't ask who they were. She didn't say thank you. She didn't look at Hollis Brackett even once. She walked straight to the court clerk, and the first thing she said after a full day and night was that she wanted her phone back. She asked when it would be returned to her. She asked whether there was any way she could have it immediately. The clerk told her that sealed property had to go through the formal return process, and that it might not be ready until that afternoon. Josie nodded. She drew the folded apron a little tighter against her chest, then sat down on the long wooden bench against the wall to wait. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon before they called her name, and Josie signed the property return form, took the sealed bag into her hands, and tore open the plastic right there at the counter. The phone was dead. She asked to use an electrical outlet, sat down on the hallway floor against the wall, and waited until the battery had charged a few percent, never taking her eyes from the screen. When the phone came on, the text messages appeared first, followed at last by the voicemail icon with the number 3 beside it. She stood, walked toward the middle of the hallway where the signal was stronger, and pressed the phone to her ear. The first message had been recorded at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning. A young woman's polite voice said she was calling from patient coordination, that Nell Calloway's file had been reviewed and approved by the medical board, that the family had been awarded a treatment placement through the assistance program, and that Josie should please call back to confirm before the end of the business day. The second message had been left close to noon. It was the same voice, a little less cheerful now, saying she was calling again to remind Josie of the confirmation deadline, and that if she was having any difficulty getting in touch, someone else could call on her behalf, as long as confirmation was received before 5 o'clock. Josie stood motionless in the middle of the hallway. Someone passing by had to step around her, but she didn't move. The third message had been recorded shortly before 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. The woman spoke much more slowly this time, and there was a hesitation in her voice, the hesitation of someone being forced to read words she didn't want to say. She explained that because the family's confirmation hadn't been received within the required period, the treatment placement would, according to procedure, be transferred to the next file on the waiting list. She said Nell's file would remain active and the family would remain on the list, and that they would be contacted again when another round of reviews became available. She said she was very sorry. Then she wished Josie a good evening and ended the call. Josie listened to all of it. She listened until the final beep. Then she lowered her hand, held the phone in her palm, and stood there for a very long time without doing anything. She didn't cry at first. She simply walked outside, descended the courthouse's stone steps, and sat on the third step from the bottom, both hands resting on her knees, her back bent slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the road. Her neatly folded apron still lay beside her. Emilio stood about 5 or 6 steps away, near the end of the railing. He had seen her listening to the phone. He had seen her lower her hand. He didn't approach her. He didn't say a word. He only stood there and motioned for Gideon Marsh, who had begun to step forward, to remain where he was, because there are moments when even a word of comfort becomes an insult, and he had lived long enough to know when such a moment had arrived. Darkness slowly settled over the courthouse. One by one, the people inside left for home. Josie remained seated on that step. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, when only the 2 lamps outside the gate were still burning, Emilio walked over and told her he would drive her home. She didn't ask who he was. She stood and followed him. The pickup moved through the empty streets, and for a long stretch of road, neither of them spoke. Then Josie turned toward him and asked him directly. She asked what he had really come to Ledgewood to do. Emilio kept his eyes on the road ahead. He said he was only passing through. He said he had business elsewhere in the state and had stopped for breakfast because he had seen the diner's lights burning early. Josie looked at him. She looked for a long time, long enough for him to know she was watching. She didn't say she didn't believe him. She didn't ask another question either. She turned toward the window, and they traveled the rest of the way in silence. When the truck stopped in front of her building, she opened the door and stepped down, then paused for a moment and thanked him for bringing her home. It was the only thank you she spoke that entire day. The following morning, before daylight had fully broken, Bernice Alderman called the number Gideon Marsh had left behind and gave him a single message. She wanted to meet privately with the man who had been sitting at the corner table before the diner opened. Emilio arrived at 6 o'clock. She unlocked the door to let him in, locked it again behind him, and didn't turn on all the lights. She poured him a cup of coffee, set it down in front of him, then went behind the counter and opened the bottom drawer, the one that was jammed so tightly she had to pull it twice before it came free. From the very bottom, she took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, yellowed along the creases, and placed it on the counter before him without saying a word. Emilio opened it. It was a notice of termination, typed on the diner's old letterhead, with the date printed in bold in the upper corner. The name of the employee being dismissed was Teodora. The reason appeared on the second line, brief and blunt, taking a customer's tip money. Beneath it were 3 signatures. The first belonged to the former owner. Bernice didn't recognize the second. The third, written in the lower right corner beneath a typed title identifying the signer as Deputy Sheriff, belonged to Hollis Brackett, written in the hand of a much younger man, far more careful and deliberate than the scrawl he now placed on official reports. Emilio said nothing. He laid the paper on the counter and kept one hand resting on it. Bernice began to speak, and she told the story without stopping, in the even voice of someone who had rehearsed it inside her own mind so many times that she no longer needed to pause and remember. She said the woman had begun working there when she was very young, younger than Josie was now, and had spent nearly all her youth in that diner. She said Teodora worked the morning shift, arrived before everyone else, and during the winter, she was the one who lit the stove. She said Teodora had a little boy, whom she sometimes brought with her on the days when there was no one else to watch him, and the child would sit at that exact table in the corner, perfectly quiet, never troubling anyone. She said that every morning, Theodora made the boy a cup in her own particular way, a way no one else in the diner had ever prepared it, and she continued making it that way through all those years until her final day. Bernice stopped there. She picked up a cloth, wiped the counter even though it was already clean, then set the cloth down. She said that on that day, a customer complained that tip money left on a table had gone missing. No one counted anything. No one checked a single detail, and no one asked even one question. The young deputy sheriff came in, stood exactly where Emilio was sitting now, spoke briefly with the owner, and before closing time that evening, this paper had already been typed. She said Theodora didn't argue. She removed her apron, folded it, placed it on the counter, and walked out the door. Bernice said the worst part wasn't what happened that day, it was what happened afterward. This was a small town. News traveled faster than anything else. Theodora applied for work at the laundry, at the restaurant out on Route 2, and even at the warehouse to the north. And everywhere she went, people told her they would consider it, then never called her back. Bernice said she managed to hold on for a while longer, then moved away, and after that, Bernice never heard anything more. For the first time since she had begun telling the story, Bernice raised her eyes and looked at Emilio. She said she had kept that paper in the drawer through all those years, through 2 different owners and a complete renovation of the kitchen, and she had never shown it to anyone. Then she said the words she had carried inside her chest even longer than the paper had lain in that drawer. She said she had been standing right there that day. She said she knew Theodora hadn't taken the money, and she said she had remained silent. When she finished, she turned away, opened the faucet, and stood there washing several cups that were already clean. Emilio remained silent for a very long time. Then he folded the paper along its original creases, carefully, without creating a single new fold, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, beside the photograph. That afternoon, Josie returned to the diner to collect the rest of her wages for the week, and retrieve the few things she had left in the employee locker, and Emilio was still sitting at the counter when she walked in. Bernice poured each of them a cup of coffee, then went into the kitchen and closed the door behind her. Josie sat down with one empty stool between them. She asked whether he was the one who had paid for the lawyer at the courthouse the day before. He said he was. She asked why. He said he had been there, he had seen what happened, and he hadn't liked the way it happened. Josie turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter, then stopped it. She said there was something he ought to know, because if he intended to involve himself in this, then he should understand exactly what he was getting involved in. Then she told him. She said her husband's name had been Dean, that he had worked for a construction company that took contracts outside the county, and that he had died at a job site one afternoon in April, when a section of scaffolding collapsed. She said they had called her at 4 o'clock, and she had been holding the little girl in her arms when she answered the phone. She continued in a voice so calm that Emilio had to turn and look at her. She said the scaffolding had already been reported as unsafe, that one of the workers had warned the foreman, and that the warning had been entered into the safety log. Then, after the accident, someone altered the logbook. Someone had seen the foreman sitting there changing it during the night shift. Not one person. 7 people. 7 workers had stood there and watched, and when her lawyer went looking for someone willing to sign a statement, all 7 of them refused. She said she didn't blame them, at least not anymore. One had young children. One was still making payments on his car. One told her he was sorry, truly sorry, but he couldn't afford to lose that job, and he asked her to understand. She said she had understood. She had understood every one of them. The company went to court with the altered logbook, and testimony claiming that the worker had ignored procedure on his own, and the company won. She didn't receive a single dollar. She said she had been 24 years old then, and her little girl had only just learned to walk, and she had sat in the courthouse hallway exactly as she had sat on the steps the day before, thinking something she had never told anyone. She had thought that her husband hadn't died because of the scaffolding. He had died because 7 men were afraid of losing their jobs. Emilio said nothing. Josie took a sip of coffee and set the cup down. She said that 6 weeks earlier, when Mr. Kessler had been stopped outside the diner and all the money he was carrying had been taken, 7 or 8 people had stood there watching. Then, when his lawyer asked who would sign a statement confirming that he hadn't resisted, they were all busy, or too far away to hear clearly, or merely passing through. She said she had stood inside the diner listening as each person refused, one after another, and she realized she was hearing the very same tune she had heard 3 years earlier, only with different words. She said Bernice had warned her not to sign, and Bernice had been right. Bernice was always right. Then she raised her eyes to Emilio and said one final thing. She said she hadn't signed because she was brave. She wasn't brave at all. Her hand had trembled while she held the pen, and she hadn't slept that night. She had signed because 3 years earlier, she had made herself a promise that no matter what happened, no matter how poor she became, she would never become the 8th person among those 7 men. When she finished, she stood, placed her folded apron on the counter, and went to retrieve her belongings from the employee locker. The story began to turn on Saturday morning, and it turned so quickly that no one had time to see it happening. Hollis Brackett returned to the Copper Kettle with a new search warrant, this time accompanied by Dunlap and 2 other men, and he didn't enter through the front door. They went straight into the employee changing room behind the kitchen, opened every locker, and from the compartment marked with a strip of tape bearing Josie's name, they pulled out the leather wallet, shoved beneath an old sweater. Brackett held it up between 2 fingertips for everyone to see, and within 30 minutes, the entire town knew. The wallet was empty. There wasn't a single bill inside. Bernice stood outside the kitchen door and said loudly that the locker had no lock, that everyone at the diner knew the code to the back door, and that Josie hadn't even set foot in the place for 3 days. No one recorded her statement. That afternoon, when Gideon Marsh requested the footage from the camera above the counter from Thursday morning, he was given a file with a gap in it. Nearly 1 full minute was missing, precisely the span of time when Brackett entered the diner and sat down at table 7. The person responsible for the equipment explained that the recorder was old and sometimes skipped that way, and no one offered a better explanation. On Sunday, Brackett's attorney filed an objection to the recording Emilio had obtained inside the diner. Gideon Marsh read it, then called Emilio, and he didn't waste time. He said that in this state, recording a conversation required the consent of everyone involved, that he had examined the matter from every possible direction, and that the chances of the recording being admitted were almost non-existent. He added that, worse still, the very fact that Emilio had made the recording would be used by the other side to portray him as someone who had staged the entire affair from the beginning. Emilio listened to everything, thanked him, and ended the call. The only thing he had held in his hands since Thursday morning had just been erased by a single line of procedure that he couldn't dispute with even 1 word. But the hardest blow came on Monday morning, and it didn't come from Brackett. The county newspaper published its morning edition with an article placed just below the fold on the front page. The article reported that during the previous week, representatives of interests in Philadelphia had made inquiries about the mortgage on Ledgewood's Central Municipal Building, and that according to the newspaper's sources, the person behind those inquiries bore the name Castellano, a name whose history the paper devoted an entire paragraph to recounting. The next paragraph connected that name to the incident at the Copper Kettle. The final paragraph raised a question the newspaper didn't answer, asking why an organization of that kind would take an interest in a waitress from a small town, and stating that the people of Ledgewood deserved to know what was truly happening where they lived. By noon that day, no one in town was talking about the wallet anymore. They were talking about something else. They said it turned out she had powerful people behind her. They said no wonder she had dared to sign those papers for Mr. Kessler. They said who could possibly know, after living in the same hallway with someone for all those years and never knowing a thing. Hollis Brackett hadn't needed to invent the link he required to connect a poor waitress to a larger story. It had been delivered directly into his hands, printed on paper and supported by respectable sources. Emilio read the article close to noon, standing in his office in Philadelphia with the newspaper spread across the desk. He read it slowly, all the way through, including the final paragraph. Then he read the second paragraph again. He said nothing. He didn't strike the desk, call anyone, or ask Gideon where the information had leaked from, because he knew exactly where it had come from. He stood there with both hands braced against the edge of the desk, his eyes still resting on the page, and remained that way for a very long time. Then he folded the newspaper in half, set it down, and pushed it a little distance away from himself. Carefully, almost gently, the way a person sets down something he no longer wants to hold, but can't bring himself to throw away. The letter arrived on Wednesday, tucked between a supermarket advertisement and the electric bill, and Josie read it while she was still standing in the hallway, before she had even taken off her coat. It was printed on the letterhead of the Child Welfare Agency, its language as polite and dry as every official letter, informing her that the agency had received information, and would be opening a case to assess the living environment of the minor child in the household. On the line stating the grounds for the review, it said that the information received referred to a connection between the child's guardian and a criminal organization. There was no accusation. There was no conclusion. There was only one typed sentence in the middle of a white page. Josie read it a second time, then carried it into the kitchen, placed it on the table, and sat down in the chair across from it. She remained there until darkness had completely fallen. The following morning, she took the bus to Philadelphia. She had no appointment. She stood in the lobby of the building, gave her name to the person at the desk, and less than 10 minutes later, Emilio stepped out of the elevator. He was about to say something, but she spoke first. She told him he had to leave Ledgewood. She said he had to withdraw every lawyer, send back every person carrying boxes of documents, and never set foot in that town again. Emilio asked whether she understood what that meant, that if he withdrew, there would be no one left standing on her side. Josie said she understood. She said she understood perfectly, and that was exactly what had kept her awake all night. She said he was the only person in that town willing to stand beside her, and now she had to stand there and tell him to disappear, and she knew exactly how ungrateful that made her. Then she said the rest more slowly, as though she had arranged every word during the journey there. She said she had finally understood that Brackett didn't need to prove she was guilty. He had never needed that. He only needed to turn her into someone people were afraid to stand near. And he had succeeded. She said that people at the diner were changing tables now when they saw her approaching. She said her landlady had asked her about the newspaper article. She said she could endure all of that. She had grown used to enduring things, but she couldn't endure the piece of paper lying on her kitchen table, because it wasn't aimed at her. Emilio stood motionless. He didn't argue a single word, and that was what made Josie turn her face away. She said she didn't blame him. He said she should. She shook her head and said she had to leave in time to catch the bus. That afternoon, when she opened the door to the apartment, Nell was lying on her stomach on the living room floor, with a box of crayons scattered around her, and the little girl sprang up and ran to show her the picture before Josie had even stepped fully inside. She held up a sheet of paper with 3 people standing beside one another in front of a house with a chimney. One tall person, one short person, and another person with white hair standing beside them. She pointed to each figure and explained, "This is Mama, this is me, and this is Mrs. Marlene, because she lives in our home too." She said she had drawn the sun a little too big, but that was all right because it really was sunny today. Then she looked up and asked whether her mother liked it. Josie said yes. She loved it very much. She said it clearly and normally, and she added that she would put it on the refrigerator, where everyone who came inside could see it. Nell squealed with delight and ran to get a magnet. Josie held the drawing in her hands, turned her face toward the window, and remained there until the little girl returned. The word reached Emilio near midnight, and it didn't come from his uncle. It came from a man Emilio had assigned to follow Aldo Castellano since the previous summer, something the entire family would consider unforgivable if it were ever discovered, and he had done it anyway, because he had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing never came from outside. The message was very short. 4 men had left the city at 11 o'clock in 2 cars, heading northwest. Aldo had told them they needed to clean up a small matter in a small town, that his nephew had been fumbling too long with something that should have taken only 1 evening. Emilio didn't call his uncle. He got into his truck and left half an hour ahead of them. On the outskirts of Ledgewood, where the main highway met the road into town, there was an all-night gas station with 2 pumps and a sheet metal canopy. Emilio parked beneath the canopy, shut off the engine, and leaned against the truck door. He stood there alone, without calling anyone to join him, both hands in the pockets of his jacket, and waited. The 2 cars turned in close to 4 o'clock in the morning, and they slowed when their headlights swept across the familiar pickup beneath the canopy. 4 men stepped out. No one said anything for the first few seconds. Emilio spoke first. He called the nearest man by name, then asked whether his wife was still teaching at the school on Reed Street, or whether she had moved somewhere else. He called the second man by name, and mentioned that his boy was entering 7th grade that year at the school behind the church, then asked whether he still played baseball. He called the third man by name and asked whether his mother had been released from the hospital yet. Then he called the 4th by name, the youngest of them, and said only that he knew the young man's father, that his father was a decent man, and that he wouldn't approve of what was happening that night. Emilio said all of it in the voice of a man making genuine conversation, without placing emphasis on a single word, and without stepping forward even half a pace. None of the 4 men answered. Emilio said he wasn't asking why they had come down there, because he already knew. He said he was asking only one thing, whether they intended to be home having breakfast with their wives that morning. He said their cars still had more than half a tank of gas, more than enough to reach the city before daylight fully broke. He told them to leave. The man standing closest to him opened his mouth and said his uncle had given an order. Emilio said he knew exactly what order Aldo had given, and then he told them the part he wanted them to hear. He said that if they touched that police chief with so much as one finger that night, if they broke even one light on his car, then by the next morning that woman would no longer be a waitress who had been falsely accused. She would become a woman with criminal power standing behind her. And from that moment forward, every word she spoke, every paper she signed, and every witness willing to stand beside her would be treated as the words of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by someone else. He said they wouldn't be saving her. They would be burying her. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the engines of the two cars still running. The youngest man was the one who spoke. He asked what she was to Emilio. Emilio looked at him for a moment, then answered that she was nothing to him. He said he had met her on one morning, that he didn't know her parents' names, that he had never stepped inside her home, and that he would gain nothing, no matter how the matter ended. Then he said one final thing. He said that was exactly the point. The youngest man turned away first, then the third. The two cars backed out of the station, turned around, and their taillights grew smaller along the highway until they disappeared completely. Emilio remained beneath the metal canopy for a while longer, listening as one of the gas pumps gave a single click and then fell silent. He knew that before dawn, Aldo would hear what had happened there, and he knew the price of it would be collected on another day. The meeting was called on Friday afternoon, on the upper floor of a restaurant that had been closed since noon. And when Emilio walked in, everyone was already seated around the long table. Aldo Castellano sat at the head of the table on the far side, in the chair where Emilio's father had once sat, the chair that, by tradition, should have belonged to Emilio. No one stood when he entered. Aldo began at once, without an introduction and without circling the point. He said the family had given Emilio years to do what he called putting the house back in order, that everyone had remained silent when he shut down the old operations, remained silent when he forced them all to pay taxes, remained silent when 300 people lost their livelihoods because of his decisions. He said they had remained silent because Emilio bore the Castellano name. But what happened at the gas station 2 nights earlier was different. He said Emilio had stopped the family's men in order to protect a police chief, and there was no way to explain that to the people seated in that room. Then he laid down his conditions, stating each one clearly, one part at a time. Withdraw every lawyer, every auditor, and everything else from that town. Sever all ties with that woman. No contact, no money, no messages pass through anyone, and never speak of the matter again. He said that if Emilio agreed, everything would be put away as though it had never happened. If he refused, the council would vote, and Aldo didn't need to say what the outcome would be because everyone in the room already knew. Emilio didn't sit down. He stood at the near end of the table and removed the ring from his 4th finger. He placed it on the wooden surface, then pushed it forward with 2 fingers, until it came to rest in the center of the table. He did it before anyone had time to raise a hand. A chair scraped against the floor at the far end of the room. Someone said his name. Aldo said nothing. In the brief silence that followed, everything Emilio had built since he was 31 years old slipped from his hands without a single document needing to be signed. 6 companies, 2 ports, the network of relationships his father had spent a lifetime weaving together. The power to pick up a telephone and know with certainty that the person on the other end would listen. And the final thing, the thing whose value he only truly understood at the exact moment he lost it, was the right to walk through that city knowing there was always someone standing behind him. He left that room with one small transportation company he had built himself at 27, held in his own name and beyond anyone else's reach, and nothing more. Aldo called him back when his hand was already on the doorknob. He asked Emilio one final question, and he asked it in the voice of a man who genuinely wanted to know, not one trying to wound him. He asked whether Emilio was giving up all of this for a waitress he had met on a single morning. Emilio turned around. He said no. He said he was giving it all up for another waitress, one whom no one had been willing to sacrifice anything to save more than 20 years earlier. Then he asked Aldo whether he still remembered her name. He said she had been Aldo's sister-in-law. The room went completely still. Aldo sat straighter, and for one brief moment, the hardness on his face slipped away, revealing something far older than his years. He didn't answer. Emilio added one more sentence, and he said it more quietly. Not for the room, not for his uncle, but for himself. He said that besides everything else, he owed her. He said he had been the one who pushed her even farther down. Then he opened the door and walked out. He descended the stairs, left the building, and walked toward the place where his vehicle was parked. Along the way, two men stood smoking outside the entrance of a familiar tavern. Men who only the month before had nodded to him from across the street. This time they saw him, and they turned away. Emilio took note of it and kept walking. For the first time in his life, he understood exactly what the woman had been living with for the past 3 years. Micah Rowan went to the federal office in the city on a Tuesday morning, driving his own car, dressed in plain clothes, and completely alone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't notify the police union. He sat in the waiting area for nearly 40 minutes, with an envelope resting on his lap. And when Naomi Whitlock came out and asked what he needed, he stood and said he was a deputy with the Ledgewood Police Department, that he had been present in the diner that Thursday morning, and that his body camera had been running from the moment he walked inside until everything was over. He added that the footage had uploaded automatically to the server as soon as he returned to the station, that he hadn't deleted it, and that he wouldn't have had the authority to delete it even if he had wanted to. Then he held out the envelope. Inside the office, they opened the file and watched it from beginning to end. The footage showed the wallet lying on table 7 for nearly half an hour. It clearly captured Josie's calm voice from the beginning to the end, recorded her offer to turn out the pockets of her apron right there, and showed that no one inspected them. It captured everything Hollis Brackett said to the remaining customers after she had been taken out to the patrol car. It recorded the old man at the counter speaking up and the look he received in return. And it preserved all 3 questions asked at the diner door and all 3 answers, including the final one, every word perfectly clear. Whitlock asked whether he understood what this meant. Micah said he did. He said the town had only one police department, that he wouldn't be able to find work in the neighboring county once people knew who he was, and that he had already considered the possibility that he would have to move somewhere else. Whitlock asked why he had come anyway. Micah remained silent for a while. Then he told her that when he finished high school, his family hadn't had the money to pay for his training, and the man who paid for it had been Hollis Brackett. He said Brackett was the one who wrote the recommendation that helped him enter law enforcement, and that he still kept a copy of the letter in a drawer at home. He said Brackett had stood behind him when no one else even knew who he was. Naomi Whitlock said nothing. They placed a written statement before him to sign. Micah picked up the pen, and before he put it to the paper, he added one more thing. He said that on the first day he received his badge, Brackett himself had taught him that the badge didn't belong to him, that it had only been entrusted to his care, and that the day he forgot that was the day he had to give it back. He said he still remembered the exact words. Then he said that perhaps Brackett had forgotten what he had taught, and that he had forgotten it long before Micah was even born. He lowered his head and signed. His hand trembled, visibly and badly enough that the person seated across from him had to look down at the desk to keep from embarrassing him. But the signature didn't blur. He wrote his full name, added the date, then pushed the paper back across the desk and stood. When he reached the door, he stopped and asked only one question. He asked whether the footage would help her. Whitlock said it would. Micah nodded, thanked her, and walked down to the parking lot. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he remained that way until he felt calm enough to drive home. Josie had spent night after night thinking about that locker, and she thought about it in the way a person thinks when there is nothing else left to do. The employee locker was behind the kitchen. It had no lock of its own, but the diner's back door required a code. Bernice knew the code. The morning cook knew it, but he had been away for 2 weeks caring for his sick mother back home. The dishwasher knew it, and he had only been working there for 10 days and had never met Hollis Brackett. The 4th person was Delphine Okoye, the afternoon waitress, the young woman Josie had allowed to stay in her cramped apartment for nearly a month, the previous winter after her landlord put her out during the coldest part of the season. Josie ruled out 3 people, then sat for a very long time with the one name that remained. On Thursday afternoon, she walked to the boarding house at the end of 3rd Street and knocked on the door. Delphine opened it, saw her, and the girl's entire face collapsed before Josie could say a word. She invited Josie inside in the voice of someone who already knew what she was about to hear. The small room held only one table beside the window, and the two women sat across from each other. Josie didn't ask any questions. She didn't mention the locker, the wallet, or the code to the back door. She opened her purse, took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, unfolded it, and placed it on the table, facing Delphine. It was a handwritten note in Delphine's own hand, recording the amount of money she had borrowed in the spring to pay her brother's lawyer, along with a promise to repay it little by little each month, and her signature beneath it. Delphine looked at the paper, then raised her eyes, and they were already red. Josie said nothing. She picked up the paper with both hands, tore it in half, tore it once more, and placed the pieces in the middle of the table. Then she said she hadn't come there to collect a debt. She said she had come so Delphine would know that she still remembered what Delphine had needed. Delphine lowered her head onto the table and began to cry, crying the way a person cries after holding everything inside for too long, and finally being unable to hold it anymore. She told the story through her tears, in fragments, and without any order. She said Brackett had called her aside in the parking lot behind the diner, that he hadn't threatened her at all, that he had only spoken very calmly about her brother's file waiting in the prosecutor's office, about how some files sat there and went no farther, while others sat there and were moved forward, and how that depended on many different things. She said he had given her the wallet inside a paper bag, told her to put it in that particular locker, and promised that afterward, the other file would remain untouched. She said she had stood outside the diner's back door for nearly half an hour, and she had thought about Josie the whole time. "I thought about you, Josie," she said. "I thought about you the entire time, and then I opened the door and went inside anyway." Josie sat still and listened to everything. She didn't shout. She didn't stand. Then Delphine wiped her face and said something Josie hadn't expected. She told Josie not to think Brackett had approached only her. She said that after all those years in that town, she wasn't the first person, not even close to the first. She was only the first one to speak. Josie sat straighter. She looked at the young woman across from her, the woman with whom she had once shared half her sleeping space and half her meals. And she asked only one question. She asked whether Delphine's brother was all right now. Delphine looked at her, and that question made her begin crying all over again. Aldo Castellano arrived outside Emilio's house before dawn, alone, and he didn't ring the bell. He stood beside the pickup truck parked in the driveway until Emilio came out and opened the door. Then he placed a thick file on the hood and pushed it toward his nephew. Inside were things no law office in the world could have obtained. Accounts held in other people's names while the money continued flowing back to the same place. Regular transfers made to someone working in the county prosecutor's office, and an entire list of names belonging to people who had paid to make certain files remain untouched. Aldo said he had voted to take Emilio's ring, and that if he had to vote again, he would vote exactly the same way. Then he said this had nothing to do with the family. He turned and walked several steps before stopping. Without looking back, he said that more than 20 years earlier, he had been the one who drove his sister-in-law home on the day she was fired. He said she had cried the entire way, and he hadn't spoken a single word. Then he got into his car and left. That morning, Gideon Marsh read the entire file in 2 hours, then looked up and said plainly that with this much in their hands, Hollis Brackett wouldn't last 3 weeks. He said they only had to put it in the right place. There would be no need for court, no need for witnesses, and no one would ever trace who had delivered it. Then he said the rest, the part he knew Emilio would ask about. He said Brackett's son-in-law was one of the names on the list, that the man was carrying a large loan, and that if the file became public, he would lose everything within a month, taking his wife and 3 young children down with him. Emilio sat staring at the papers on the desk for a very long time. Then he picked them up, carried them to the fireplace, and burned them. He said that more than 20 years earlier, one man had destroyed an entire family simply because it had been easy, and he had no intention of becoming that man in order to punish him. Gideon watched the flames, then said quietly that he had made 3 copies. Emilio said he knew. He told Gideon to bring all 3 of them there, and that he would sit and watch him burn every copy. The road that remained was much slower, and it passed through people no one in town had ever thought to notice. Bernice Alderman brought in a recording from the old camera mounted in the corner of the kitchen. The camera a former owner had installed to watch the cold storage room, the one Hollis Brackett had never known existed, and it had captured the entire stretch of time that had disappeared from the camera above the counter. Alvin Kessler brought in the footage he had recorded on his phone that morning, and hidden away out of fear. The footage he had stopped filming almost immediately when Dunlap turned his head. The old man from the counter wrote his own statement by hand with a ballpoint pen on lined paper, 3 pages in all, his writing unsteady but clear, then drove it in himself and submitted it. After that came others, one by one speaking about an evening when he had been detained without receiving any paperwork, another speaking about cash that had never been returned. Then the state audit report was released. Exactly $3,000 was missing from the Ledgewood Police Department's evidence room. The shortage belonged to Alvin Kessler's traffic stop, the case in which the report stated that $4,200 had been seized, while only $1,200 had ever been entered into evidence. The inventory was scheduled for Monday. The wallet had never been stolen at all. Brackett had needed a theft to fill a hole before someone opened the evidence room and began counting. And he had needed a thief the entire town would believe in immediately without asking a single question. And the amount he had blurted out at the diner door that morning, in front of 40 people and a camera that was still recording, was the exact amount he had been trying to hide. The evidence he had created to destroy her became the very thing that destroyed him. Several months passed, and spring came to Ledgewood in the same quiet way it came every year. The Child Welfare Agency closed its assessment file with one brief conclusion, stating that there were no grounds for further review, and Josie read that sentence 3 times before she could believe it. Every accusation against her was dismissed, and the state's official findings identified her by name as the victim of a deliberate false accusation. Emilio offered her a check. She wouldn't take it. She told him that if she accepted his money, then in the end, Brackett would still have been right, that she would still be the kind of person who lived on someone else's money, and she said that her dignity was the last thing she had left, so she wouldn't sell it. What she did accept was assistance from a newly established community fund in town, a fund open to applications from anyone in Ledgewood, with public records and a list of approved recipients posted on the library bulletin board. The fund bore the name of a woman who had once served coffee in that very diner, and most of the townspeople had never known who she was, until they read the small plaque hanging by the entrance. Nell's case was reviewed again during the spring application period, and this time, Josie answered the call. The little girl began her treatment program in April. As for Josie, 3 evenings a week, she took the bus to the community college in the neighboring county to study victim advocacy, a profession devoted to sitting beside people who had just walked out of a room like the one where she had once sat, doing the exact work she had desperately needed 3 years earlier when no one had been there to do it. One morning, near the end of May, the bell above the door of the copper kettle gave a light jingle, and Emilio walked in and sat at the small table in the farthest corner, just as he had the first time. Josie brought out the coffee, but this time, she placed 2 cups on the table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. On the wood-paneled wall behind the counter hung a new frame containing the old yellowed photograph of a young woman standing behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, and Bernice had driven the nail into the wall herself. Nell came running in through the door, healthy and noisy, climbed onto the seat beside her mother, and began telling a very long story about Mrs. Marlene's cat. No one in the diner applauded. Instead, as Josie passed their tables, people rose one by one, each without saying a word, and that gesture said more than any apology ever could. This story leaves us with something worth carrying in our hearts. The most dangerous prejudice never shouts insults in the middle of a crowd. It lives quietly in the moment people decide who is least likely to have anyone defend them, then treat that decision as though it were perfectly ordinary. And a small injustice never stops with the person who suffers it. It travels onward through generations in ways no one can foresee. Ledgewood didn't change because a powerful man walked through the diner door that morning. It changed on the day ordinary people decided that silence had become too costly. Because a person's dignity never depends on whether someone powerful is standing behind them, and the kindness we give when we have nothing to gain is the only kindness that is truly real. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And if you have ever witnessed a moment like this in your own life, please leave a few words in the comments. We truly will want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.